Very well for me.
Yeah. So just to give some context, Jim, first before we start. So this the audience that we've got on this is comprised of students from 3 different courses. So they're from ENVR 560, was in environmental accounting and reporting. We've got students from ENVR 660, which is environmental management tools. And then we've got students from ENVP 322, which is the undergrad course in sustainable development ideas and concepts. So that course that you taught way back, 322. So we've got a mix of kind of students of different focus and levels.
Good.
And also there's a general invite to former students and people within my distribution network who are all over the place working and stuff like that. So we got a mixed bag of tricks, basically. And so I imagine that some of the questions that will come our way are going to be coming from different perspectives. So I guess we could just keep that in mind. So without further ado, I think we should just dive in.
Absolutely.
And get at it. So everybody, welcome to the podcast tonight. We have the honor and privilege of having the great Dr. Jim McTaggart Cowan join us this evening, who is a humble man, but is also worthy of that moniker, the great, because he's been a tremendous mentor of mine over the years and professor, and has had a career that most people don't have that kind of opportunity to work on so many different types of problems in the environmental space, as Jim has worked on and studied. And it gives one a different perspective on, at least in my opinion, you can cut through the stuff. You know, you can cut through some of the rhetoric that's associated with some of the issues that we face today, based on the experience that you've had over the years. So your core background, as I understand it, was in meteorology and atmospheric science, PhD, up to the PhD. And then after which you started working for Environment Canada, was it? What was it? Maybe just give a high level of your...
Oh, sure. I can tell you quickly, very quickly. Yeah. I started with the air quality division in Meteorological Service Canada at the time. Mm-hmm. I guess it was actually called the Atmospheric Environment Service, but we were dealing with air quality research issues. And we started with issues associated with acid rain. And we also touched on the whole area of local air pollution problems. Then I moved on in a number of different ways, but I moved into a science liaison position, then into a government funding of environmental sciences. I was director in the Energy, Mines and Resources at the time of environmental sciences. I participated in the early introduction of the whole environmental assessment movement, as well as with acid rain and ozone depletion, and then moved on from Energy, Mines and Resources. I was dealing with nuclear issues and oil and gas issues, energy issues, energy efficiency issues, the whole gambit of issues associated with resource management. I then came to the province of British Columbia. I was with the federal government up till then. And then I was in charge of air quality in the province of BC, and then ultimately wound up at Royal Roads teaching. Anyway, basically my background has covered all the major atmospheric environmental issues, including acid rain, ozone depletion, general air pollution, fine particulate pollution, and of course, global climate change. So it's been a whole broad context.
And what drew you to it, like from a personal standpoint? Your father was was a meteorologist, correct?
That's correct.
So did you grow up at like dinner table having like air quality conversations or
meteorology questions?
Yeah.
More than anything else. Not air quality. That came about actually simply because it was my first job outside of the university. I I did my PhD on cloud physics, so it was totally different.
Okay.
So I got into the whole area of air pollution in 1973.
And so in terms of like the training that one requires, because I know even when we studied it, when I was an undergrad in railroads, we had specific training that although we did the atmospheric science and meteorology stuff, there was a lot of which was specifically dictated or directed at air quality issues, like say understanding particulate matter and so forth. Has that, like back when you started, did they have that kind of focus, or was it just like you had been trained in atmospheric science and meteorology, therefore here you go, here's a bunch of stuff to work on? How has it changed the training for it?
Well, the problem is that the training basically came from the experience point of view, yes, because the whole area was the involvement of the air pollutants and their impact on humanity, basically on the environment. And therefore it was the air movement that was the big issue. There were people who were dealing with air pollution from the point of view of smokestack emissions, and they typically came from the engineering side because they understood the technology. But they were dealing with it from the point of view of coming out of the smokestack. We were dealing with it from the point of view of the fact that once it's out of the smokestack, it's dispersed, it goes all over the world. And therefore we were dealing with it with a problem of the human interaction and the environmental interaction as caused by the atmosphere moving the pollutants from one place to another.
Okay. And how would you think, has that changed over time, the training, like the training today, for instance, would it differ, you think, somewhat from before? Because I know, for instance, like to give an example, for those that are in ENVR 560, environmental reporting and accounting, part of the training and part of what we work on that is how do we put economic valuation and look at what do we need to report on in terms of various different environmental phenomena, whether it be air quality or biodiversity or water quality, and therefore like look at ways of quantifying and putting some sort of, carbon taxation being a good example, some economic values on it, which is relatively new. Have there been other aspects of the kind of the base training that you think have evolved or changed?
Well, I think it's broadened.
Yeah.
You need different types of people involved now than you did then. We had in the air quality side, we had chemists, certainly, and we had engineers, and we had the atmospheric scientists, and those were sort of the basics. Now you have to include the natural science, not the natural sciences, the biological sciences in a far greater degree because of the interaction of the air pollutants with the biology. And therefore, what you're dealing with more is interdisciplinary teams, a lot more than we did before. Also, you've got a lot more interest in the whole policy issue. And that wasn't very important at the time. In a sense, you had the scientists basically and the engineers pointing out the pollutant was coming out of a particular source. How could you control that pollutant? What happened to it once it got out into the atmosphere? And you certainly had the biologists, the fisheries biologists, for instance, who were very much involved with the whole acid rain issue. And so you had the groups of scientists working on particular issues. You didn't need to have the broad policy initiative the same way as you do now. And that is, I think, what has changed. The economists were not heavily involved. You certainly had some involved because of the concerns the industry had with regard to coming up with the solutions for things like acid rain and the whole issue of the ozone layer. And certainly industry was involved, but it wasn't the same scale, shall we say, of involvement as you have now with global climate change.
Well, and also, if I may add to that, I think what I'm seeing now, at least over the last 4 to 5 years, is that a greater, like, economists have been in the game for, I don't know, I mean, well, even for the last 20 years, but more predominantly in the last 10 or 5. But in the last 3 to 5, I'd say, we're getting more and more sociologists, psychologists, social scientists and human scientists, like people looking at some of the ethics associated with this. A good example being how are communities who have more economic disadvantage being disproportionately impacted, say, by things like air quality or negative, bad air quality in certain regions. So this, like, in order to understand that problem, you need to have like tools and knowledge of, economic geography, social geography, and all that kind of stuff. So I see more of that in the work now.
Yes, I would agree with you. That's part of what I mean. You need this much broader interdisciplinary team than we had initially.
Right.
But interestingly enough, you haven't talked about the policy and the politicians.
I haven't talked about the policy and the politicians, or
yeah, you've been talking about the economists, the sociologists, and these other groups, but you haven't talked about the role of policy and legislation and regulation and that sort of thing in this whole issue.
Well,
I mean, very important.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, I was avoiding that for now because of my great source of frustration by that question in Canada right now, but whatever, we can get to that. But yeah, like, what do you see the role of then as we start to approach this? We can understand the problem, but we need to engage and understand what role government has. So from a regulatory standpoint, also the private sector, civil society, and so forth. Let's start with government. Like, what do you see as the primary principal role of various levels of government in terms of addressing air quality problems?
They have to be someone has to be doing the strategic thinking, the long-term aspects of trying to figure out what we need to really consider in trying to deal with any of these issues. And that is where I would say we're lacking terribly. We don't have a good strategic thinking group. Government is tending to respond to the social highlights coming from the social media and not from a point of view of strategic thinking at all. And I think we see that in spades right now. And I would caution your economists to look very carefully at their analysis, because in many cases they're leading us in the wrong direction. And I give you a good example. The economists came up with this whole idea of the just-in-time delivery systems a number of years ago. It came out of the School of Economics in Chicago. And the whole idea was, we can save a whole lot of money if we don't have inventory warehouses. We can do everything by just-in-time delivery through trucks. Well, yeah, the economist, the person who is thinking that way very narrowly, failed to recognize the consequences of that sort of action, because they didn't look at all the other parts of it. Air pollution went up tremendously because of suddenly you were having trucks going all over the place with small loads instead of having trains deliver big loads to warehouses. You had trucks on the roads all over the place. So your carbon dioxide emissions went up, your NOx emissions, your particulates, all sorts of things went up. And they weren't costed in at all because of the whole thing. And then look what happened when COVID came along. And you suddenly had a restriction on supply. You had supply problems, you have lack of drivers and all those sort of things. And your whole delivery system has fallen apart because we don't have inventory. Inventory is coming from China. Globalization, well, that's great, but it may be a good economic solution. It is not a good social solution, and it's certainly not a good environmental solution. So you have economics being driven and accepted by the politician willy-nilly without any recognition within the economic community that they're only one small part of the whole issue. And they can't be simply the whole drivers, and yet it is presumed that the economist has the gospel truth and no one else does. And yet look at the mess we're in now because of it.
And so traditionally speaking, one of the roles of government at various different levels has been monitoring. So having infrastructure and operating infrastructure to assess what levels of air quality are and so forth and so on. And now that won't change. Like, that should remain part of the responsibility of government agencies, correct?
Absolutely, because the whole point is that government takes on those things which an individual really can't have an impact on. And an individual company trying to do sampling around the world would be impossible, or around the country even. Governments clearly need to do the monitoring aspect. And they also need to give direction to where they want industry and the public to be going. And I include the public in there because, for instance, right now you have this lovely idea of the government has come up with that everybody's going to have an electric car.
Right. Yeah.
Now, the myriad problems that are associated with that aren't even thought about in government. It has just come up with something popular. Some of the environmental groups have been lauding it as a great solution without any thought of the real consequences of that sort of policy, without any thought of the real meaning of it.
Sorry, what policy was that? It cut out a little bit.
It was his EV policy.
The EV policy.
Electric vehicle.
Yeah, we just had a discussion about that last week in our class forum.
Yeah. So Jim, that's a timely note, because
Okay.
we had a discussion in which I think, Richard, you were involved with that discussion, and one of the key people in it, in which we were raising that point exactly. It's saying, like, on the surface, this sounds like a great policy to have, promote EVs, but what about the source of electricity? Do we have enough? What about the impact, the total environmental impact of EV implementation? All the rare earth minerals, all of the materials that go into creating battery infrastructure and so forth and so on.
And you've got to get the public on side.
Yeah.
I drive around here, and the number of pickup trucks, the noisy pickup trucks, I will add as well, that are out there. And I can't see a person who's driving a souped up pickup truck being the slightest bit interested in a nice, quiet electric car. It's just, psychologically, it's not there. But what is the government doing to sell it? Nothing. They come up with this policy, but the policy is sort of a useless piece because there's no strategic thinking behind it. They haven't thought of all those points that you and Richard have raised. And you really, if you want to, and you feel the best way to cut down on air pollution and global climate change and all the others is to get rid of the petroleum-based transportation system. Okay, but you got to start at where is the source of the energy coming from? You basically got to get right back to the beginning, and you've got to say, okay, hydraulic, great, but as the climate changes, as we're seeing in other parts of the world right now, there isn't any water for the hydraulic systems. So hydraulic dams are good in some places. Wind, hey, sometimes you get wind, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get sun, sometimes you don't. How are you going to store it? Hydraulic is a great way to store it. You pump it up and then get it down. But if you don't have the water, what are you going to do for your energy storage? You've got groups out there screaming against nuclear, screaming against wood, screaming against dams. And yet they're also saying, oh, we've got to have all electric transportation system. Hold on now. How are we going to do this? Can't. And this is where government has to step in and start saying, okay, here's our long-term plan. This is where we strategically have to go. How are we going to get there? What are the parts we've got to do to deal with it? How are we going to make sure that at the beginning that we've got the infrastructure we need to do the final objective? It's like saying, oh, we're going to build all sorts of houses. Okay, where are you going to build them? Where have you got the land? Oh, well, the land is all this flat land. Well, it's agricultural land right now. What are we going to do with agricultural land? Oh, well, yeah, well, we'll put it here. Well, where's the water going to come from? Where's the sewage treatment system going to come from? Who's going to fund the infrastructure that's needed to put in all these homes? And even if you say, well, okay, we'll double the density and we'll cut down the water. This is one of the popular ones. We'll double the density in a city and we'll cut down on the water flow for everybody. Well, hold on now. Our sewage systems are designed to have certain water flows. If you cut the water flow, the sewage system doesn't work properly. Oh, well, that's going to be a problem. If you double the number of people in an area and you cut the water flow down, you got a major problem in your infrastructure. And yet infrastructure doesn't create lovely political ribbon cutting opportunities. So what do? You have to have that thinking that is saying, well, sure, the end result is we want more houses, but to do that, we're going to have to look at where we build them, how we put the infrastructure in. We're going to have to fund that infrastructure. We're going to have to look at different ways of dealing with our wastewater, with our fresh water. Where are we going to get it from? What dams are we going to put in? We're going to have to deal with the fact that we're going to change the environment in some areas, not necessarily make it worse, just change it. You know, and all these things have to be thought about now.
Is our government capable of that level of thinking, though, of the critical thinking and the in-depth thinking?
Is our government or a government?
Well, our government.
Well,
you know, they have trouble running an EI program and a passport program. And the government typically, it seems like the people in government, their main goal is just to get elected. So they're just looking to win the next election. They don't care about the next generation.
Richard, we've created that.
Yes, yeah. And the general population is responsible too. The voter, right?
And the social media problem is a major one, and the press, which should follow the social media, and the politicians follow the social media and the press.
Yeah, because we choose our politicians, we vote for them.
Yeah.
And what's the saying in a democracy? The people get the government they deserve.
Yeah, actually, I think there is a group actually who can do that strategic thinking, but people don't like it when I suggest it. And believe it or not, it's the military. They've been doing it for many, many years all around the world. Forget about the military part of it, but their strategic thinking part, where they look at a lot of these balances and they know the technology of how to do it, the techniques, but they're not given the opportunity to get in there and do it on the civilian side. And yet they probably are the best equipped group to do it because it's absolutely fundamental to what they do.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. But would people listen to them?
Will the politicians listen to them? That's a very good question.
Well,
And the social media, which is unfortunately not the public, but it's driving the quote public view.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's
you have now basically the small minority who are very articulate in the social media driving the system, and the largest portion of the population are just not even heard because the politician and the press tend to go to the social media people, the social media presence, the people who are social, I forgot what the term is.
Influencers.
Yes, thank you.
So Jim, in terms of,
have I said enough negative things there?
It's okay. It's okay. I knew the gloves were going to come off. So, what's the role of this strategic thinking that needs to occur, not just for air quality, but just in general environmental management? What about the private sector? Like, what role does the private sector play, and how should they be engaged with this process?
They are going to play an extremely important role in the fact that they'll probably implement it, but they need to be given pure guidance. I mean, straightforward guidance, and they need, in many cases, to be provided with a regulation that requires everyone to do it. And that's one of the beauties of policy regulation, following policy. Policy can set where you want to go, long-term goal, which should be the strategic goal. Regulation is what levels the playing field. And we all know that because we all have speed limits, and we know that speed limits are a form of regulation. And if everybody follows the speed limit, everything's fine. And in the case of industry, it's very important from the economic point of view that everybody is on the same, is playing on a level playing field. And that was one of the things I learned, was that very frequently in dealing with air quality issues, I would run into the issue of industry wanting the regulation there to make sure that everybody had to do the same thing. And once you set that up, then, hey, everybody was happy. They knew what the objective was. They knew what they were required to do. And yes, there were going to be shysters out there. We're going to try to get under the regulation, but at least the regulation and any enforcement, and you do have to enforce, and the enforcement that came with it, basically did provide them with an economic base to work.
What about civil society? How does civil society play a role in that? And I mean, generally speaking, but specifically like organized elements of civil society as well.
Well, I think it's very important that government basically provides the information that society needs and provides it in as truthful a fashion as they can. And I say as they can because they don't necessarily have all the information they need right from the beginning. But at least if they're upfront with it and give the public that information in the general sense, then they're helping things. But they've got to be careful too, in the sense that they cannot allow special interest groups to drive the equation, to drive the whole issue. And that's what's happening right now. So you have one group pushing one interest, another group pushing another interest, and I would have to say the environmental groups, some of the environmental groups are very much this way, where they're pushing one issue without looking at the consequences in other parts of the environment.
Like,
so
what's an example of that?
Well, the groups that don't want any dams.
Right, okay, yeah.
That's one example. Well, that's fine. You're going to get everything from wind and solar. Oh, sure.
Yeah.
In many cases, we can predict already that wind speeds are going to drop in many areas, or are going to become very strong. Excuse me. Very strong for a short period of time, and then virtually nothing. You know, you're going to have these big swings. Well, you can't develop a power system based on that. And then I've talked about the fact you've got to have all the storage and everything else. Well, if you can't have dams, what are you going to do? You know, and it sort of runs into the same problem. Yes, it's going to change the stream flow, but stream flow changes all the time. We've seen all sorts of cases of avalanches of rocks blocking rivers and changing them into lakes and that sort of thing. That's normal. It's a change, yes. Environment is going to change. There's no question. And we're going to have to change it in some cases. We're going to have to get a whole lot more creative in the agricultural area. That's the climate changes. If we're going to feed the number of people we've got, other than suddenly controlling the number of people we have, and I don't think most people are into that one. But if you're going to have your agricultural areas shift, then you're going to have to change the types of crops you produce. So the people who are against GMOs, well, hold on now. First of all, how are we going to change our crops if we can't change some of the genetics? How are we going to feed this population on the earth? Well, it's great to say, well, let's have less people, but this is the first one to create the control, shall we say.
Well, on the hydro front, I was up on the weekend. I was up in the Kootenays on the Arrow Lakes, and near the Keenleyside Dam and so forth. We have some property up there, and you know that for all extents and purposes is a reservoir to some degree, the Upper Arrow Lakes. But the thing is, people who live there or go there frequently, you just get used to it, you know, because while I was there, the level of the lake went up probably a good 3 feet, like in the course of 3 hours, because they're, you know, changing the levels to, you know, manage the load production.
Yeah, well, you look at California, look at their lakes and their reservoirs, and you see what happens as the climate changes.
Right, exactly. And lastly, universities, their role in this.
basically in the science side.
Yeah.
And the exploration of the economics and the social issues and everything else to help elucidate the issues that have to be faced by the strategic things. And also, there's nothing wrong with universities getting into the whole area of strategic thinking,
right,
in a serious way. They've got the skills there. They just usually don't have the willingness by necessarily all the participants, because it's not something that you're going to write papers about.
right, exactly.
And therefore you've got to change the culture of the university to get it to look at it in a different perspective.
Well,
Can't be just publish and perish.
Well, that's it. Like, there's got to be, like, what motivates people in a university context. It's traditional university, it's publish and perish.
Yes.
Whereas
that doesn't work in this case, because what we're dealing with is something that's long term. It's something that you're going to be constantly looking at the different skill sets that are in a university, putting them together and trying to sort of massage them and figure out which direction to go and help the governments basically coming up with them.
And part of that help is establishing methodologies, processes, procedures, tools, and technology to help manage some of these problems, right? Like environmental management tools.
Yes.
And so what would be some of the ones that we would traditionally look towards specifically for air quality? And then what would be some potentially new areas that I think that you think we need to kind of develop tools, or at least reapply different things to help with this?
Perhaps it isn't so much new areas as a recognition of the interlinkages.
Okay.
In the case of acid rain, it was sulfur dioxide. It's fairly straightforward. And straightforward in the sense that once the research had been done and the source was identified, then the solution was, okay, you got to reduce the sulfur coming out of the nickel plants and the coal burning and that sort of thing. And so it became an engineering problem, basically. In the case of ozone depletion, it was a matter of, okay, we created the problem, CFCs came along, they're still evolving gradually to get rid of that problem, but the sources are relatively straightforward. We know the foams, the refrigerants, fairly limited. The case of the big air pollution issue is fine particulates, without any question. The larger scale problem, even above that, is a global climate change. They are linked. Clearly, as you reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you're tending to do it by the elimination of combustion. Combustion is what causes the production of an awful lot of the fine particulate. Not all, well, yeah, pretty well, but no, not all of it, because your tires keep fine particulates too, but an awful lot of it comes from combustion of one source or another. Therefore, the two are really linked in a sense. And it's a matter of recognizing that link as you're doing things and keeping in mind the benefits that come from it. Even from the economic point of view, you might not necessarily link climate change and the fine particulates, but they are linked very clearly. You cut down on fine particulates, you're going to cut down on CO2.
So given that, I mean, it's always useful to learn from examples that have or have not worked, case studies and so forth. And I know a couple of the ones that you worked on, and there's probably many other ones, but one specifically that you worked on that were the beehive burners in British Columbia and elsewhere. Did you do it elsewhere or just in BC?
No, that was mainly in BC.
Mainly in BC.
That one's a good example, actually.
Yeah. Let's hear about that.
Because at the time, it was about 1991, 92, that the Harvard School of Public Health started to identify the fine particulate as an issue.
Mhm.
And we recognized fairly quickly that while a tremendous amount of the initiative in British Columbia was focused on air pollution in the lower Fraser Valley and the ozone near the surface that was caused by the traffic flows and everything, that the major problems from a health perspective were coming from the high particulate areas that were in places like Golden.
Mm.
You know, hey, not traffic. It was oriented, it was caused by fine particulate from wood burning.
Mm.
Now, that I don't name Golden as any particular place, any place in the valley, in any valley
Mm.
where you had inversions in the winter time, stable air masses, back to meteorology.
Mhm.
You had stable air masses, you didn't have ventilation, you didn't have a lot of airflow, back to
Mhm.
meteorology again.
Mhm.
You had the particulate being produced by the beehive burners engineering,
Mhm.
but not just the beehive burners, but also all the public heating that was going on with wood burning stoves, back to energy issues.
Mhm.
They were doing that because of the cost of oil and everything else. So you had the fine particulate going into all the small communities in the wintertime, causing much bigger problems than in fact you had in the lower Fraser Valley.
Mm.
Smaller number of people. So if you looked at it from a health cost perspective, perhaps the air pollution in the lower Fraser Valley was greater simply because of the number of people.
Mm.
But that number of people who were probably dying prematurely,
Mhm.
term, was probably higher proportionally in some of these other communities. Now, having identified that, I worked with the Department of Health provincially to start to talk to the mayors and the leaders of the various communities about the fine particulate issue.
Mhm.
But we recognized that it was not just an industry problem, it was also the public problem because of this wood burning issue. So
Mhm.
you had wood burning that was occurring by industry, wood burning that was occurring by the public. And therefore, it was a necessary function not to go after just one part of it, of the problem, but you have to get after both.
Mm.
How do you get after the public? Well, you have to do that through education.
Mm.
You had to come out with, we came out with some videos about burn hot, burn clean,
Mhm.
trying to teach people how to use their wood burning stoves.
Mhm.
We brought in a regulation that would phase out the old wood burning stoves. Now, we did that with industry.
Mm.
In fact, went to the companies that were making the wood stoves and we said, look, what is the solution? They pointed out to us the EPA in the States had already brought in regulations that required a much higher standard than what we had in Canada.
Mhm.
And yet they could not compete against the steel, the local steel company, the local iron maker or whatever, who could whip together a cast iron stove quickly and sell it, in spite of the fact that it produced particulate at a great rate, both inside and outside.
Mhm.
They couldn't put in an EPA type of stove at the cost that they could be made by a very cheap manufacturer,
Mm.
because they didn't. The guy making the cast iron stove didn't have to have it certified, didn't have to have it pollution control limits for anything else on it particulate. So we brought in a regulation with the help of the companies that manufactured the wood stoves. Okay, so that's one side of the issue. So we
Mhm.
tackled at the public point of view, trying to teach them how to burn wood, which is an interesting problem because most people who burn wood felt they knew how to burn wood, despite the fact they didn't. But they'd always done it this way, and therefore you have to try and change them slowly. So you have one side, and then you've got the beehive burners. And we worked with the industry there. Again, we gave them the policy direction in the sense that we want to find some way to get rid of beehive burners. Then we worked with industry looking at alternative uses for wood fiber and the whole area of manufactured wood products.
Mhm.
And we brought out in fact, the charts that showed all the different ways that the wood industry could use the fine particulate, use the wood chips that they currently were just burning.
Mhm.
We also worked with the companies to teach them about the economics of wood burning
Okay.
to a beehive burner. The fact that the beehive burners required replacement every so many years, they required people to look after them. We discovered that when we looked at the books on a simplistic point of view, I would have to say, we found that beehive burners were simply covered under miscellaneous. So they didn't even know what the cost of a beehive burner was. They didn't know what their replacement cost was. They didn't know the replacement cycle. They didn't know, they hadn't factored in the cost of the inspections they had to do on it to make sure that it didn't smoke too much. They didn't put in the factor of having to have somebody watching the fire, making sure that it was dampened down. And over the weekend, they didn't put in the cost of having to empty it and deal with the ash afterwards. So there are all sorts of accounting principles within the industry, within the companies, that weren't inducing them to make any change. So we had to try and point all this out to them. And in the end, we had to basically say, look, guys, if you're not going to change your accounting principles, we'll have to bring in regulation that says we're going to phase these things out. And that's what we did. But it was really surprising. No, it wasn't. I mean, it was another situation that I had seen where the accounting principles within the industry didn't lead them to properly assess their costs. And I'd seen this when I was within Energy Mines and Resources, when we were dealing with energy efficiency, where companies would ignore the cost of leaks in their steam plants and think they had to, the only way to make money was to make new product, when in fact they could make money by simply upping their maintenance a little bit and cutting down on the costs that they were losing in their poor steam systems. So it was basically a matter of trying to educate the industry and educate the public.
And did you get a lot of pushback from industry? And what kind of pushback did you get from the public? So I can imagine, you know, I grew up in the interior in Nelson. I recall we burned wood a lot when I was, you know, in the 70s and 80s, right? So I can imagine people were not so pleased with the government coming and telling them they could not burn wood anymore.
It wasn't so much a matter of you couldn't burn wood. What we did was we worked with industry to provide replacements for the old wood stoves. So what we were doing was shifting people from the old cast iron inefficient wood stoves to high efficiency EPA wood stoves.
I see.
So the first thing to do was to cut out the manufacturers of the old stoves. The second one was to cut out the retailers from selling these old products, which they could make better profit off, I guess. And the third part was to make sure that the public got these new wood stoves. So it wasn't a matter of telling them they couldn't use wood. It was a matter of, if you going into the communities and making sure that if a community had a rule about wood stoves, that if a house was sold or a person modified, that they had to put in an EPA or a BC standard wood stove. So it was a change. But also along the way, we, as I say, we tried to educate people as to how to burn wood, and that ran into problems, of course. But we just kept on providing the information. People could keep burning wood. It was just that we wanted them to do it efficiently.
So, I mean, this brings up an important point, which I think, and we covered, I remember, Jim, back in the day with Sandman's work on risk perception, risk communication, and so forth. And one of the questions that came in is from Melissa in relation to NIMBY. And I'm going to actually, Melissa, I'm going to ask if you could ask the question, just because I think it's you're going to do a better job of communicating exactly what you're trying to get at with the issues that you guys are facing right now. So floor is yours, Melissa.
Sure. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Beautiful. Yep.
Perfect. Thanks for your time today, Jim. It's very appreciated. I've been in public service for over 15 years at various levels of government, including the military complex. So I can relate to your statement there around the military having the structure and infrastructure in place to maybe tackle some of the challenges. But I'm at a regional government level right now, and in waste management, and wanting to implement diversion tactics, which will include organics. And so organics come with its own challenges around odor and air quality and issues there. And even though we've, the process under the regulations requires, really good environmental management tools around environmental impact studies and odor management plans and all of the above, you still have odor at the end of the day, and you still have the public really upset about odor and, the potential impacts that that has. And so nobody wants to look for, alternative solutions to move those locations, because then I don't want that in my backyard either, right? So then you kind of get stuck with these facilities in places that maybe they were fine when they were first put in place, and when those tools are first put in place, but then all of a sudden community identities change, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore, and then now you're managing, all these complex challenges around air quality, but then, so housing challenges and agricultural, uses in those areas. And so, for me, I really grapple with, what is the role of government, but also maybe what is the role that we as the public have too. So I really appreciate the strategic thinking piece that you brought forward, because I absolutely do think we need that. But I think our community and the public need to be strategic thinkers too. How do we bring that social cohesion so that we understand that, we need to be doing these activities, we need to be diverting organics from the landfills, but then how do we come together and understand what's our role in that situation too?
Great question. Jim.
Great question. Interestingly enough, we're dealing with that in the Nanaimo Regional District as well. And I'm actually involved in solid waste here. Part of the problem is technology. We want to do all the solid waste out in the open, in fields and that sort of thing. And that causes problems. I have seen some very effective containerized systems that work with simple odor control, like bark beds and that sort of thing, which work very nicely. And now you might say it's a matter of scale. Well, okay, that's a matter of cost more than anything else. The second thing is that, communities, we see the same thing with airports and everything else. If the municipality allows, and that's the government, the municipality allows the public to basically move into areas which it had initially assigned as rural or rural as well as industrial, then it's creating its own problem, the very same way as it's allowed people to build on floodplains. And that simply leads to the problems that we've had with flooding. So part of it is the municipality has to basically say to the developers, I'm sorry, that is an area which is assigned to that type of industry. You cannot put in housing in that area. So there's a government side of it, one government side of it. And politicians don't like to say no to developers, but hey, that's what we have community plans for, which are supposed to be strategic thinking and supposed to isolate people. So I think it's partly technology, partly the politician. The other part is that if you are going to cut down on that odor, you're going to have to go to containment. If you're going to go to containment, the cost is going to go up. If you're going to have the cost go up, the public has to realize that if they don't want the odor, they're going to have to pay for it. The same way, if the individual doesn't want to deal with the garbage, you're going to have to pay for a garbage man, and you're going to have to pay him a good wage because he's doing something you don't want to do. No, and somehow, again, the leadership in the country, the politicians, have to have some backbone and basically say to people, hey, This is the way life is. You don't want to do that? Fine. We're going to have a sewage treatment plant here. If you don't like the stink, then we're going to have to pay for a different type of sewage treatment plant. No. Does that answer it a bit, Melissa?
Yeah, and I think that some of the challenge I think that, you know, local governments are experiencing too, or maybe governments in general, there's a, you know, big push to privatizing. So governments don't like to build infrastructure and then manage infrastructure. And so that's a challenge. So then you privatize it. And so then now you don't have control of that infrastructure. So you can only do so much. And I think the public's really familiar with the command and control approach the government takes, but I think we need to be innovative in how we work with that privatization then as we move forward, because it just doesn't, it doesn't work. And then the economics really just get in the way where, you know, that facility can't invest in the infrastructure because they don't have the long-term contracts. And so then everyone's stuck, right? And so how do we do that better in terms of, you know, everybody finding their role and working through that together? Yeah.
The not-for-profit has a role in here. And I'm not sure that it has been accepted broadly enough and supported enough by the politicians. They tended to want to get their hands right out of things, as you said, just privatize it, get rid of it. It doesn't show up on our books, therefore it isn't a problem. Well, it is. The not-for-profits are out there. They do a very, very good job of the things where they're allowed and given the support that they need, but they need support as well. And government has to continue to support them. And it isn't. We have examples again in this area where we had a very good not-for-profit organization that was dealing with the solid waste issue. And the local governments wouldn't continue to support it. So it folded. So now we have a garbage problem. I mean, we didn't have a garbage problem. We had a solid waste problem before. Now we have a garbage problem because we can't get rid of their solid waste.
Right. And so not-for-profits in the sense of advocacy and education, or what other role?
Actually doing things.
Okay.
You know, not advocacy.
Oh, so they're not, it's not doing it for profit, but actually doing the work, but not for profit. I see.
That's right. So it gets it, in a sense, it gets it off the direct books. It is, they have to get a sort of grant every year to do the job. And they make some profit off what they're doing as well. But they're not profit oriented to the point where they have stakeholders who put in millions of dollars and want big returns. You see what I mean?
I think
that's the difference. There's that independent, that in between part, which in a sense it's a bit like the Crown corporations used to be until governments went and privatized most of them.
Yeah.
But it's the same sort of thing outside of government. But we need, government. Unfortunately, again, and I would put this at the seat of the economists. They've driven governments into this profit motive. I mean, to put everything out into the profit motive side.
Yeah.
And it isn't. Again, there's a role for it. It's part of it. The not-for-profits are there. Government is there. Corporations are there. And the minute you start getting this idea that, oh no, we just have government and then we have everything else is private sector. That's where the problems develop.
Yeah, interesting. Do you know of any examples in solid waste? I can think of some in the energy sector, but I was wondering, do you know of any groups that are doing that in the solid waste sector?
I knew of one in Nanaimo region, that's all.
Right.
But let me take a look at that one, because I just to chime in on this one, because I think those are both really good points that you've made. Number one point, I think, Jim, that you've nailed, which, as you know, is stuff that I'm working on in research world, is there's no such thing as a free lunch. You know, there's where we have negative externalities to socioeconomic functions, there's a cost to them. So, like, for instance, a smelly airshed is one of those costs of waste disposal that people need to understand that there's an economic cost to addressing that, much like there's an economic cost to the greenhouse effect, right? If it's an externality from combustion of fossil fuels that has created this problem. Therefore, putting some sort of economic controls on those in order to address those problems and those impacts from an ecosystem service standpoint is legitimate. Like it's what needs to happen. So I think there's an issue with respect to communicating that and letting people know and understand what this stuff means. So that then kind of gets into like, look, there's a cost, there's a social cost to this problem that needs to be borne by someone, right? So that needs to be understood by society, and people need to be okay with it and say, like, same with park conservation. You know, if we want to maintain biodiversity, in some cases, we're going to have to pay for it, right? We have to have some sort of evaluation of that. And the second part of that, I think, is, so given that there's a cost, and let's just hypothetically say we can get to that level where people collectively understand that there's a cost to addressing this environmental problem, right? So then how do we go and put in the solution, use that funding in order to address this problem? And I like Jim's idea of looking to civil society for that, because the advantage of that, and in fact, it appears to me a growing distrust of government in general, like right now. And by getting civil society or NGOs involved in that process, there's a lot of benefits to that. For one, they can be seen as the honest brokers, right? They come in and they do their job, like the World Wildlife Funds, the nature conservancies, and these type of different groups that really, like, they know their stuff and they do that stuff. It's a matter of kind of coming up with a deal and a project in which they know what their scope of work is. Like in this case, maybe it's odor control or odor monitoring or whatever it is. And then you have the cost part of that taken care of by, you know, if it's a levy of some sort or whatever it is through, you know, it's a collection of a tax, then that can work. And I have some good examples from different sectors, you know, like from the aggregate sector, from cement. IUCN has been working with a private sector company, Coca-Cola and WWF. And there's some good examples of that, but I still think that we need to have more models where it's shown that they do their thing. They're not advocates. These NGOs, they're doing stuff, right? So if you think of it from a broad sustainability standpoint, there's some significant gains from that. There's environmental problems being addressed. There's people being employed. There's economic activity being created, you know? So I do think you're onto something there with those comments, Jim, and also Melissa, from, like, you know, finding a group that potentially could help out with that problem. One of the key missing elements is that economic part, though. I think there's got to be an identification that there's a cost to that.
Well, yes, that's certainly part of it.
Yeah.
Another part is we've got to get over this idea that we can just be negative.
Mm-hmm.
And an awful lot of the environmental groups are simply being negative. They're not coming up with solutions that are practical,
mm-hmm.
and they're not trying to do things to help.
Mm.
And it doesn't help if the politician is feeling the pressure of groups that are simply negative.
Mm.
And this is where the non-governmental groups can really play a role
mm-hmm.
in looking at solutions and not just negatives, and looking at them far more broadly than they tend to do. In
mm-hmm.
many cases, my experience has been most of them have focused on one or two sides of the issue and not on the whole thing. They
Right.
haven't done any strategic thinking at all.
Right.
They've only thought of their problem that they're addressing,
mm-hmm.
and they've complained bitterly. And unfortunately, the politician has given into that.
Right.
Instead of then coming up with a solution which is practical, which helps the public understand what the issue is and actually deal with the issue and not just be negative about it.
Mm. Great.
But going back to Melissa's point, I think the key is to find groups that want to help find the solutions. And there are groups out there, as I say, in the non-governmental sector, not in the NGO, in the not-for-profit sector,
mm-hmm.
that are people that are willing to set up in the not-for-profit sector that can really help out a lot.
Mm. Good point. Other questions? We're going to kind of open this up a bit more to discussion. I think it makes it a little more.
Sure.
Anybody have any questions, comments?
Haven't I said enough antagonistic things about the economy? Come on, you economists,
Yeah.
defend yourselves.
Anybody?
I'll go after you even more.
Yes.
You economists blame the meteorologists. The meteorologists at least assess their success and
Yeah.
their failures. Most economists don't.
I'm going to throw one out there then.
I can't even get them to rise for that one, eh?
I'm going to throw a question out there. So one thing that I've noticed in popular media and so forth, when I talk with anybody about environmental problems, it's climate change is the issue that pretty much dominates the whole kind of the whole discussion, basically socially. Why do you think that is? Like, why is, because you yourself have identified the fact that these are integrated problems. So if you're going to talk about climate change, you could talk about air quality issues, but you could also talk about, rather than say, why are greenhouse gas emissions so high? One could also say, why don't we have a strategic energy plan for the country, right? So why do you think, and why do you think that is? Like, why is that the case? And then also, what are the issues with that? Like, what are the impacts of that kind of singular focus on certain issues?
When have you seen the press do anything other than look for something antagonistic, or something that bleeds, something that cries, and some crisis that they can basically sell their papers for? People have forgotten that the press are out there trying to sell, and they believe that they're representing something. They're representing another private sector interest, which is to sell papers, make a profit. Social media, unfortunately, as I said already, we've got social media influencers who are tending to only look at what will make them look good. And they're not really trying to find solutions to issues. They get much higher coverage if they're antagonistic to something the government is doing, because government's a wonderful whipping boy these days. And government isn't responding to it, and it's just going along with it. So there's your, I think, basic problem. The vast majority of the people are just tuning out.
Elsa, you have a question. The floor is yours.
Hey, hi, Jim. Thanks for being here. I'll lower my hand. So I tried to resist asking this, but you know what? I'm going to go for it anyways, and then I'm going to use this in my unit discussion. So surprise. You had said, and this is about just in time. So I am curious as to your point of view based on what data you had indicated just in time, GHG emissions, lots of trucks going all over the place, that sort of thing. So during your podcast, continuing on, I'm doing a little sideline research here, because my first inkling was, well, I mean, aren't we, if you're not using just in time, aren't you at risk of overproduction? I mean, overproduction, over inventory, you've got space constraints. I mean, no room for potentially technology, yada, yada, yada. There's lots of other sides of the argument. So if you look at somebody like 3M, and they've got sort of their flavor on, just in time, and their flavor on pollution prevention is their solution to sustainability. If you're actually not producing the material in a just-in-time type of scenario, well, aren't you then not producing some of the byproducts? And I just want to get your take on that. Little devil's advocate here.
No, I like that, because in fact, what you've done is I identified the range of complexity that comes into the issue. You're quite right, from an economic point of view, and from a certain part of the environmental point of view, overproduction is a problem. On the other hand, there are huge costs associated with the just-in-time part of it. So there's a trade-off probably in there that I would argue that the trade-off was not considered, that we swung from one side of the issue to the other. So that we had warehouses, and yes, we may have had products, but we did have ways of getting rid of that, and that was sales. So companies came up with cells to get rid of the extra product that they had. And you could say, well, yeah, that led to overproduction and the environmental consequences of that, yes. But then by swinging over to just in time, you've increased the wear on roads, you've increased the wear on trucks, you've increased the air pollution problems, you've increased the global climate change problems, you've increased the destruction of the biology, because in fact, road corridors tend to have some real problems from an air pollution point of view, and the impact on the agriculture associated on either side of the roads and all that sort of thing. So it's a matter of looking at the consequences of both sides of the issue, and you probably need a bit of both.
Yep. And
you know, and not
thank
just
you for qualifying that. Yeah.
Yeah, and not just one. And the problem is we've gone from big warehouses to no warehouses. You know, everything's just in time. Well, hold on now. Yeah, it's sort of like the political side too. It's just swinging from one side to the other instead of being in the middle.
No, appreciate the response. I'm always gonna throw a little devil's advocate at you always. Thank you.
No problem. Enjoy it.
And if I might add to that, though, and I think something that could kind of maybe support both sides is whether you're going just in time or taking a more kind of staged warehoused approach. In either scenario, like you may need, depending on what's going on, I think from a strategic standpoint, at least for those in the environmental management tools course, if you don't have the proper set of analytics that goes with any specific set of decisions, you're flying blind. Like from a strategic standpoint, you could look at the full cost environmentally of just in time versus, you know, maybe a moderate approach or a full on like, you know, buffered with big warehouses. And by having that kind of set of data from before you start, like from a SEA standpoint, then at least you have a maybe, and don't make it complicated, have 3 different scenarios, like full just in time, a middle just in time, and then full warehousing inventory management system, whatever it is. And look at each one of those and look at what are the costs and the benefits from each one economically, socially, and environmentally down from life cycle, from, you know, cradle to cradle, right?
Yep.
So
absolutely, and that is where the governments need to come in with a lot of the metrics.
Yeah. Yeah, like that's should be a part of the decision-making process and planning process at the government level, and also the private sector as well. I think the private sector has a role to play there as well as using those tools.
Well, that is back to my comment about energy efficiency and the companies that didn't want to look at the cost of maintenance as being an important factor in their profit line. And that actually goes back to the accounting processes. In many cases, the accounting processes that are being used by industry and by government are not adequate. They're not teasing out the real information that the decision maker needs. And in the case of some of the companies that I dealt with, they were so blinded by the economic belief that you had to have a new product to make money, and the idea that reducing your cost made you money as well seemed to be an anathema. They couldn't figure it out. And in the case of the beehive burners, they frankly didn't have an accounting process that properly accounted for the real cost of anything.
Reducing costs isn't sexy.
That's right.
Richard,
you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
You're absolutely correct, Richard. And that's part of the problem, is that the industry is like government. It's looking for the sexy side of the whole issue. It's far more fun to be able to announce a new product than it is to say, gee, I just saved twice as much by increasing the maintenance I did on, you know, do my maintenance works every 3 months instead of every 6 months.
Definitely. Questions, other questions? Who else wants to jump into the fray? And controversial, or at least dissenting opinions are welcome here.
Absolutely.
Don't be shy. This is your chance to kind of throw curveballs if you want. Anybody? I'll call on someone if they don't.
Quiet.
So,
Would put everybody to sleep, I guess.
I think so.
Pity.
Anyway, so I think if we're to wrap things up in terms of concluding thoughts, oh, Christina, go for it. Floor is yours.
Have we lost Christina?
Your hand's up, Christina. You can type it if your audio is not working. Audio isn't working. Okay, type your question in. Okay. I was wondering if you could talk briefly about regenerative agriculture. Okay.
Out of my league.
Out of your league? Yeah, I can't really talk about it in any great extent. What aspect of regenerative agriculture? Oh, and the transition away from pesticides. Yeah, I can't really talk too much about that, at least with any kind of sense of, professional input. Jim?
No, I can't either. All I can do is warn that, again, shifting away from everything, how are we going to feed everybody? We know that the biology is going to change in the sense of the insects are coming north, that we're further south, and therefore they're going to have a wonderful time.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is going to happen around the world. Therefore, there are going to be problems.
Yeah, I can speak to it in terms of some of the work that we do in developing countries, and like we all have the idea or the goal that we can have completely organic produce and so forth, and not use fertilizers and so forth. But in many of the countries that my team and I work in, Guyana being an example, Trinidad, Tobago, and so forth, pesticides are a real necessity. Like they have some very nasty invasive species in some cases and so forth that can decimate crops. Like they can really have serious economic impacts to these countries.
Health impacts as well, because if you can't produce your crops, people are going to have problems.
Yeah. So I mean, there's that productivity. We deal a lot with invasive species and so forth. So I mean, I always like to look at these situations. The Green Revolution, like the reason why we were able to basically avoid very significant famines in the 80s was through biotechnology and invention of various new fertilizers and so forth. So there's a lot of literature I can share with you on that, is what role biotechnology played in the Green Revolution in the late 70s and into the 80s. Like in the 80s, I mean, we had famines, right? Global famines and all throughout, and we don't hear of that as much now. And a lot of that has to do with technology.
Well, David, we're seeing the need for it already in the agricultural side as the climate changes.
For sure, 100%. Drought-resistant crops. How are we going to make crops drought-resistant?
Yep. And how are we going to make them so that they will grow in soils that they're not accustomed to?
Absolutely.
Because the soils in Canada are different than the soils in the United States. Mm-hmm. And as the crops move further north, the tundra is a very different growing area than the prairies.
Yeah.
And we're going to have the products produced.
And that's a very good example of this idea of managing trade-offs. Like we cannot have it all. Like it just simply will not work in a lot of different cases. So we have to look at the costs and the benefits of some of these issues. So like in pesticide use, for instance, yeah, there's a potential cost of health impacts and ecological impacts, but at the same time, we have to, research. We get guys like Matt Dodd and other folks at RU who are, know the organic chemistry and so forth, and can analyze what is an acceptable level of pesticides. Maybe are there some more benign pesticides that we can use, or some other methodologies that are going to achieve the same effects, but you really need to dig into the problem. Melissa, or let's go to Steph. Steph.
I thought I would jump in. I'm not sure if this is in your realm, if you can answer this, but I thought I'd throw it out there. So first of all, thank you so much for the discussion. It's been great so far. I work in the composites industry. So the company I work for is a manufacturer of fiberglass reinforced underground storage tanks. We are a large emitter of VOC and HAP emissions. And our company has turned to me to say, okay, we want to reduce our emissions through thermal oxidization. I don't know much about this because it will be one of my projects looking into the future. I do know that they're extremely expensive and have lots of maintenance. This is something that the company might want to take on, but I want to look at the environmental side of things. What is your take on thermal oxidization?
I think you have to. You've got a public perception problem that burning anything is causing a problem. So you've got to be very careful about your emissions from thermal oxidation. Part of the problem with the plastics is not the problem that they're currently addressing. It's the fact that the public have been sold the idea that we can't burn the plastics cleanly. In fact, you can very nicely. And the cement industry is a perfect place for it. So it's the same sort of argument that you have in what you're dealing with. Thermal oxidation can be done very effectively. And if you ensure that the temperatures are high enough, you can break down all the products completely. And I have no concern about that side of the issue. It's the public perception and the political perception that is the problem. So it's more, that is where your big problem is going to be probably. I would suspect the engineering problem is fairly simple.
So if I may jump in there. So with the problem of the VOCs and the need for use of thermal oxidizers to eliminate or reduce VOCs, where is that coming from? Is that coming from regulators just saying you need to reduce your VOC emissions in this state, wherever you're doing your production?
No, well, I can't get into too many of the details.
Yeah.
One would be from a lawsuit, and then the other, it was around environmental activist groups and styrene, because styrene in California, and we work in California, the Prop 65 chemicals. So a lot of attention there, especially in the area that we're in. Which is interesting that there was part of that during the conversation earlier about municipalities allowing businesses and residential to move into previously industrialized zoned areas, which has happened in our case, and now it's a big thing. But the other one is, from my perspective and my understanding, it's all about economics. So they want to reduce their emissions, their styrene emissions, and VOC emissions, because of our permitting limits, our Title V permits, so they can increase production, so they can make more tanks.
Sure. Seems reasonable.
So in your opinion, it's okay? Like thermal oxidization do you think doing nothing and just continuing on the way that we are is better, or installing thermal oxidization is a good approach?
Well, so Jim, in terms of and this is a question to you, Jim. So with the thermal oxidizers, they break down the VOCs into acceptable emissions, right? So I guess it would be a CO2 emissions, maybe some SOx, NOx. I'm not sure what would come out, but it's not going to be carcinogenic VOCs, or right? Correct? Is that the motivation?
If the temperatures are high enough, there isn't a problem. You look at the fact you've got the incinerator in Vancouver.
Right.
It works very effectively until some public group starts to make it an issue in the social media, and then everybody gets upset about it, the press cover it and everything, and then it dies down again and it disappears, because it is controlled. They know exactly what they're doing. The temperatures are kept very high.
Mhm.
It's monitored carefully. So all of that can be done. That's an engineering problem.
Mm.
And in fact, apart from the fact that, yes, it's carbon dioxide, but then people want the products.
Mm.
So what are you going to do?
So given that, Jim, just to jump to throw this back at you. So the science works. We get rid of that.
Yes.
Say they make the economics work. So we can install one of these machines and it's all good. We can pay for it. It pays for itself and maybe reduce litigation, right? You can make that rationale.
Yep.
But you've just put up a plant, a component, a new component to you in your California facility with a big old stack on it, spitting stuff out, and along rides, I don't know, whatever the local NGO is. It says, what are you doing? There's vapor coming out of that. You're contributing to climate change. What happens then? Jim, are you saying that that could go sideways?
Yep.
Yeah.
Because you have to have the politicians on side. One of the beauties is that one of the falsehoods that's out there and is not challenged, unfortunately, is the constant picture of cooling towers and all these plumes going out of. We've all seen these pictures of these big cooling towers, particularly around the nuclear power plants, and the vapor that comes out of them, which is all water vapor, and yet it gets covered in the press as pollution, and yet it's water vapor.
Right.
You know, and unfortunately, in many cases, the scientists are not out there. For instance, you asked about the universities. Some of the universities professors ought to be out there saying to the public, that isn't an issue. That can be controlled, that can be done. And that's a role that the universities could be playing. And they're not. Very, very many times, because they're looking at their methods of getting money, and they're worried about that too. But I think, Steph, that it's the politician and the public that is the problem, and not the science and not the atmospheric problems.
And something, Steph, that you.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Finish your thought.
I was just going to say it's a perception. It's not the reality.
Well, that's it. And Jim, I was just going to build on that, because Steph, so one thing you may want to consider as you're kind of going back to your work desk to take what you've been told to do and roll it out forward as a scenario for the management team is, so yeah, that's feasible. It works environmentally because we're addressing that problem. The economics make sense, but we're going to have to think about public perception of this program, because if they ignore that, you've heard from a person who has spent his whole career dealing with public perception issues around environmental issues, ranging from beehive burners to nuclear issues to, whatever it might be. You may find your company may be in a stickier situation than you would have thought if you don't try and gauge that or assess what the pushback might be from something that you're engaging that makes a lot of sense from an environmental standpoint and also from your business standpoint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
So Melissa, we had a question here. Any recommendations of innovative organizations / governments to watch, especially around using EMTs in creative ways? So Jim, I want to throw this at you. I have some ideas, but I know we used to talk back of different countries that have been quite progressive in their approach, like say, for instance, Germany with their use of renewable energy for quite some time. Are there countries or organizations that have struck a chord with you over the years as to like they've really kind of used strategic thinking, used environmental management tools in an effective way?
I'm not really up on it right now, David, in the sense of what's going on. I know the whole issue in Europe, of course, has been totally upset by Putin's move on the Ukraine. And therefore, an awful lot of the longer-term plans, which were strategically thought through and everything else, have been thrown out because of that. I do see some really progressive work going on in some countries. The British have done a tremendous amount in reducing their use of coal so has Germany, so have a number of the other European countries.
Mhm.
I'd say a number of the states in the US have made a lot of progress.
Mhm. I can speak to one that strikes me right away. And in fact, Canada could even be thrown in on this one. But Sweden has done some pretty interesting work on life cycle assessment of their timber industry. So they've done LCA in kind of a policy context by looking at the how they manage their timber, using it different ways. So non-forest timber products, biofuel, all this kind of stuff. So I've seen some reports way back from them, and they continue to do that kind of work. And there's some other examples of governments that are using these things effectively. I would say for circular economy, I think there's some countries these days. Well, here's a good example, Jim, is the whole thinking around hydrogen and development of hydrogen hubs. Like throughout Europe, I mean, they're way ahead. Like they are doing some really progressive stuff with respect to strategic planning of hydrogen infrastructure. Whereas in Canada now we're starting a bit, but we're really like a bit of a ways behind. Like Edmonton is kind of one of the epicenters of this.
We started looking at that issue back in the 1980s.
Yeah.
You know, it's absolutely appalling how little Canada has done in those areas because we were leaders in that area.
Yeah.
Same with the small nuclear power, which is suddenly starting to come up as an issue again. We were doing that back in the 80s, and just let the whole thing just fold. I just going back to the other point, the environmental building industry is in fact, I think, one of the organizations that is really trying to come to grips with it. They have been trying to come up with ways of evaluating buildings on the basis of their sustainability and giving awards to organizations that have made buildings that are far more sustainable than they used to be. They are trying to get people to understand the use of certified wood products, how to use wood products in place of iron and steel, and all sorts of things like that. So I think there's some organizations out there that are really, some industry organizations that are really trying to do things and are going to push government. I wish North American governments would do something. But
FSC is another good example. The Forest Stewardship Council,
yes,
I believe, and they're not new. I mean, they've been doing this for a while, but they've been very impressive with their eco-labeling. So when you go and get FSC certified products, whether it be photocopy paper or something like that, you can rest assured that behind that FSC certification, there's a tremendous amount of very high quality research that's been done and progressive audits. So they don't just like go to a company and say, okay, you can produce FSC certified stuff, stamp, here you go, see you later in 10 years. They go back and they audit and review people that are claiming to use that standard. And so that's, in my opinion, a good example of a very kind of rigorous and how do I say, consistently applied standard.
Yes, I would agree with you.
Yeah. Great. Other questions? Anybody else? All right. Well, I think we might be getting people thinking, and we've got some ideas, and hopefully we put some ideas on the table that can be helpful for some of the folks that have joined us tonight and those that will watch later on. I just wanted to take a chance, Jim. Always a pleasure to have you on and come back and share some of your years of experience and wisdom. And
it's always fun to be with you, David. And look, if any of your students have questions after the fact, and who look at the video afterwards and want to ask some questions, don't hesitate to send them on to me. I'm quite happy.
Yeah, we can
talk to you on the phone or talk to you this way or whatever way you want.
Absolutely. So I know there's a lot of you on here that are working in various levels of government, and I think that's, I mean, even just during this last hour and a half, I mean, the problems that you're facing are, problems that Jim, you've seen plenty of times. So feel free to reach out. You can email me, or we can get you Jim's contact information. You can redirect your questions to him and set up an email or a chat or whatever. We're, Royal Roads doesn't stop at Royal Roads. I was a student at one point in time. Now I'm was an alumni and now I'm teaching, and I imagine probably 25 or 30 years from now, I'll be in, sitting somewhere warm, hopefully, and jumping on Zoom calls to next generation of people at Royal Road.
I hope so, David.
Yeah, great. Well, Jim, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Everybody, thanks for coming out. We really appreciate your questions and your interest in this area.
Good. Thank
Okay.
you.
Take care,
Bye.
Jim. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.